The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. When Judas had left them, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and God will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little while longer. I give you a new commandment. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you also should love one another. This is how all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The Gospel of the Lord. We all have heard this gospel or this idea before about the importance of loving one another, and it's easy to think about loving the people maybe in our own parish, the people that we choose to love that are in our lives. But I'd like to take us a little bit deeper and a little bit more challenging. How many of you have a friend in another Christian church in the Yampa Valley somewhere? You have a friend in any other churches, right? A couple of you do. There's a lot of other Christians in this valley, right? And I've been meeting with the pastors of Routt County for the last 17 years. We meet about once a month. It's called the Christian Ministerial Association. And one of the things we've been talking about is sharing a homily series or a sermon series for 3 weeks. And this is the first week. I didn't do it last night because of confirmation. But we came up with a homily series called The Art of Neighboring, and focusing on the greatest commandment of Jesus, and it's based on this passage from Luke 10 about the Good Samaritan, okay? But the Good Samaritan parable is set up because this scholar of the law comes up to Jesus and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, you know the law. You're a scholar of the law. How do you read it?" And the scholar of the law says, "Well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." The scholar of the law is quoting 2 verses from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. Basically, we know the summary. Love God, love your neighbor. The whole gospel message, the entire Bible, can be reduced to those basic. That's the summary of the law. In Matthew 22, Jesus says that all of the love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is the first, and the second commandment is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And all the law and all the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. And so then this scholar of the law says, "Well, okay, but who's my neighbor?" Right? That's the bigger question, right? We know we should love our neighbor, but who's our neighbor? And then Jesus goes on to tell the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so the focus of this homily series, this sermon series, is like, what if we were to really take that commandment seriously and literally? Like, who are the people in our life? Who are the people that God has put us next to, that come across our path? And are they really our neighbors? Because we tend to want to define who our neighbor is, right? Galatians 5, Paul says, the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. He's quoting Jesus again, right? The whole law is summed up in that. And so Paul and Jesus, they're not mincing words. They're saying that loving God and loving neighbor is the very essence of the Christian life. It's the core of all things Jesus. Right? It's all over. He gives that message the night before he dies in today's gospel reading. This is how they'll know you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. As love of one another as I love you, and then he goes to the cross. So it's simply put, but it's very challenging, right? It's not easy to do, but it's simply put, love God, love your neighbor. But we tend to complicate it, right? Because like this man in the gospel, he's like, well, who's my neighbor? We sort of want to, we can get on board with the idea if we get to define who our neighbor is, right? The neighbor that I have in my head. If we can define the word neighbor and who we choose to apply this to, then it's a little bit easier, right? And so Jesus tells this guy, he says, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is fascinating. And I know that's not the gospel for today, but for the sake of unity in this valley, I want to share with you, these are the pastors that are preaching this series with me. The pastor of Steamboat Christian Center, the pastor of Anchor Way, the pastor of North Routt Bible Church, the pastor of Uzoa Bible Church, the pastor of Venue Church and Christ Covenant Church, and here at Holy Name. So for the sake of unity, we're going to focus a little bit on this gospel reading today and challenge us all to take it practically. So Jesus, he tells this parable of the Good Samaritan where, the guy falls in with robbers, they beat him up, they rip him off, and they leave him for dead in the ditch. And 3 people come alongside on the road. First, a priest. And a priest, back then, you probably know, he was we could reasonably think that a priest would be a nice guy. A priest should have love for his neighbor, right? Kind of like any pastor, especially someone who's in desperate need. But what does he do? He crosses the road, gets as far away from that ditch as possible, and he walks by. Why? Well, he was a descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother. He had the responsibility for offering sacrifice in the temple. He was on his way to Jerusalem, from Jericho to Jerusalem. So he had some religious duties to fulfill. And one of the laws, a couple of the laws, talked about you have to remain clean. In Leviticus, it talks about you stay away from blood. Stay away from dead bodies and other substances that might make you ceremonially unclean, so that when you get to Jerusalem, you can offer sacrifice in the temple. So the priest is saying, I'm obeying the law. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do. I can't make myself unclean. And so he sort of justifies himself. In his mind, he's just obeying the rules. Also, a Levite comes by, and he also walks by on the other side. The Levite was from the Hebrew tribe of Levi, and he assisted the priest in the temple. So he also needed to respect the Jewish laws and keep himself ceremonially clean for his job. So he thinks he's obeying the law as well. And then a Samaritan comes by, and you probably know this, but the Samaritans were despised by Orthodox Jews a couple hundred years earlier. After the Babylonian conquest, the Jews went off into the diaspora outside of Jerusalem, and they intermarried with the Samaritans. And the Samaritans they worshipped some other gods, and so they were considered, half-breeds. They had intermarried. They had caved in, and they weren't Orthodox Jews. And so the Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem despised them. They didn't like them. So there was a great rivalry between them. It would be unthinkable at the first century for a Jewish rabbi to tell a story that takes a Samaritan and upholds him as the hero. That's exactly what Jesus does. He's the guy that goes over and picks up the guy, binds up his wounds, pours oil and wine into his wounds, puts him on his own animal, takes him to an inn, takes care of him. And the next day he gives the innkeeper 2 denarii and say, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you on the way back. And then Jesus says to this scholar of the law who's asking him the question, which one of these 3 proved to be neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And it's obvious, of course. He said, the one who showed him mercy. And then Jesus says, you go and do likewise. That's why it's probably one of the most famous parables in the Bible. It's so darn challenging, isn't it? You go and do likewise. We learn basically 3 points from this parable. First of all, we don't get to choose our neighbor. Secondly, love requires proximity. And 3, love requires action. And so very briefly, the conventional wisdom is that we get to choose our neighbor. You know, we can say, we can determine who our neighbor is. They're the certain people that we have an affinity with, that we share history with, that we share a lifestyle with, that we share a religion with. Those are our neighbors, but it's not limited to that. Yes, they are our neighbors, but this parable is saying, don't limit it to that. You don't get to choose your neighbor. Judging by this man's question, who is my neighbor, he had an idea of who his neighbor was, and it didn't include Samaritans, probably didn't include the Romans or Jewish tax collectors or women with bad reputations or the ceremonially unclean. They weren't his neighbor. But Jesus blows that idea out of the water, saying it's not just the people of your own tribe. Jesus is saying that our neighbor is anyone, meaning there's no way to cop out on our responsibility to love. It's not reserved for certain people that we deem fit of our love or of our service. And so that's the first thing. We don't choose our neighbor. They're just there. God puts them in our lives. God puts them in our paths. Love requires proximity, second point. Both of the men that passed by their neighbor, they were steeped in the law. They had their reasons why they choose to keep their distance from this neighbor. And that motivated how they read the law, right? And they used the law as a justification. I can't get messy. I can't get unclean. I can't get caught up in that messy situation. So their interpretation of the law caused them to ignore their neighbor in need, which was, as Jesus says and as Paul says, this is the whole summary of the law. Love your neighbor. And so their interpretation of some law prevented them to see the main point, the whole reason for the law, right? And so the law was not fulfilled in them. Does your interpretation of your faith cause you to shrink away from your neighbor or to press into them? To press into them. This parable means we cannot love at a distance. We need to get close enough to identify our neighbor's needs and to serve them in a meaningful way. It requires proximity. It's challenging, right? Love requires action. The neighbor in this parable was the one who showed mercy, the one who had pity and compassion, the one who showed up, who took the risk, who spent his life, energy, and resources to help this neighbor in need. Love requires more than just a distant pity or compassion. It requires action. Now, I want to just caveat. Today's Operation Good Shepherd Sunday. Okay, so it fits in here. That's one really good way to love our neighbor. We've been doing it for years. Take up a collection, and gosh, we give a lot of money away. We help a lot of people very practically. So, there's definitely a place for that. But the pastors of Steamboat are trying to take us a little bit deeper here and say, what other kind of action can you do? The Good Samaritan had means to help the man in need, and so he did. It's radically countercultural. Because it's easy to be on autopilot. We've all got full schedules. We've all got all kinds of things we're trying to do every day, appointments and errands and responsibilities. To drop everything and then just go help a stranger in need, it's pretty radical. Do you know that the church has a teaching that if you're on your way to church on Sunday to fulfill your Sunday obligation and you see someone in need along the way, you can stop and help them and you're dispensed from your Sunday obligation? That's actually a teaching in the Catechism. It's based on that parable, this parable. Love requires action, and action requires time. And for many of us, time feels like a resource we just don't have, right? I totally can relate to that. And so the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. What does it mean to have time, to make time to love our neighbor? It's hard, but we need to have a little margin within our life to be able to do that. So there's a tension, right? These are the principles. We're called to love God. We're called to love our neighbors, but we don't get to pick our neighbors. So how do we do this? It may sound simple, but it's not easy. It's actually really hard. Where do we start with that? The next couple weeks we'll go into this. We'll shrink it down. We'll get it to a more practical level. The question we need to start with is, what if? What if we take the second half of this great commandment literally, love your neighbor as yourself? And we love God, that's why we're here, right? But to love our neighbor as ourselves, what if we took it literally? And asked the question, who is my neighbor, like this lawyer? They're the people that live near us, right? Now, maybe you all know your neighbors. This series is kind of designed for people maybe who live in cities or towns who, maybe don't know their neighbors. Some of you probably know your neighbors. You've been living by them for years. But what would it take? What would it look like if we spent time focusing on loving the literal neighbors, the people that live near us? Not that we don't love everyone else, but to focus on the people God has put in the midst of us. When we look up from our lives, who do we see around us? Who has God sovereignly placed us in proximity to? Why focus on our literal neighbors? If we try to love everyone, we usually end up not really loving anyone, because it's like if you're trying to shoot at a whole bunch of targets at once, you're probably going to miss them all, right? If we're not intentional, we actually just end up having a metaphorical love of neighbor. It doesn't mean that we don't love some people and not others. Jesus loved everyone, right? We see it in the Bible. He loved everyone that he came across, all kinds of crowds of people, but he also focused on disciples. Then he also focused on 12 apostles. Then he also focused on 3, Peter, James, and John. So it is appropriate to focus our efforts on a few, to invest in them in a tangible way. And so I want to challenge myself. I need to be challenged by this. And I want to challenge all of us in our community to take Jesus' commandment literally so we can be known for a livable and tangible way. Jesus said in the gospel today, by this all will know you are my disciples, because you have love for one another. They're going to know you're a Christian by your love. And so we could be known for the literal and tangible love that we have in our little mountain town here in Steamboat and the rest of Routt County. And so the vision is this. We have a practical idea here. And we're going to challenge people to think about this. What about having a block party? If you live in a block, if you live in town, or just with your neighbors somewhere around, what about just gathering them together to just get to know them a little bit and have a meal? What would it look like if we loved our neighbors and the literal neighbors? Like, what would it look like if we if we blessed them without expecting anything in return? What would it look like if we prayed for them consistently and compassionately? If we sought reconciliation with them if there's been disagreement or tension, even if it's not our fault, seek reconciliation. What if we built relationships and learned more than just their names or the types of car they drive, but if we really learned their stories, their dreams, their struggles, their spiritual journey? See, that's eventually the goal. You get to know them, you find out something about their spirituality. Then there may come a time to talk about your faith with them. What if we invited them into our homes, into our lives in a tangible way, and then showed them Jesus because they see him in us in some way? And so all of these churches are going to be focusing on this for the next couple of weeks, and we're thinking about inviting people to have a block party. And if you want to throw a block party, or if you want to have some kind of party with the people in your neighborhood, let me know, like what neighborhood it is and when it's going to be, and your contact information. And we're going to post this on a website, and all these churches are going to share that information. And if there's a block party in your neighborhood, you can go to it and meet other Christians and maybe meet some non-Christians. But we want to try to take this town back for the Lord. There's lots of Christians in this town. We need to get on the move, loving our neighbor, right? Sharing Christ with one another. And so we can begin by praying. That's where I'm going to end this homily here. Just begin by praying about it. Start with your own heart, Ask the Lord if he's calling you to respond in a more practical way in this way. What can you do to love your neighbor more? Because the Lord is calling us to do that because he wants to take his world back.